Hi everyone, Brock here back for part 2 of our basic concepts in the advanced variation of the French defense. And today we're going to be discussing the light squared bishops. Now, in part 1, we discussed the center and the impact that this extra space that white has in the center has on how we should play the game. And so we discussed how these pawns are locked against each other with the pawns for white pushed a little bit into our camp. And so that takes some space away from us. So we discussed how important it was to fight back against the center and not just let them use that space advantage. But what I wanted to do now was to look at the impact that this space advantage has on our bishop compared to their bishop. So if we look at our bishop here, because these pawns are shoved into our camp a little bit, our bishop jams up against our central pawn, which is locked. It rams up against the opponent's pawn. And so this bishop doesn't have as much scope, doesn't have as much freedom of movement as our counterpart does on f1. Because if we look at this bishop is free to develop along this entire diagonal, and it could even come out to d3 and exert influence on both sides of the board. So this is a really good minor piece for white. But if we look at ours, we only have one square that we can move to right now, whereas white has a large number of squares. And so in this video, what I wanted to do was to look at ideas that black can employ to try to address the situation of our bishops. And so there's two main things that we were going to explore. One is to look to see if we, as black, can trade off our bishop, preferably for their bishop. So just swap those light squared bishops off. And then in the second part of this video, we'll look at how we can try to make our bishop more active if we don't swap off those bishops. So let's dive into part 1, where we look at how we could potentially swap off these bishops. All right, so let's look at a few different ways in which black can try to exchange off these light squared bishops. Look at a few examples. And one thing I would just mention real quick is the French is a very rich, beautiful opening, and so there's many different interpretations and many different ways for black to play the French defense, and that's one of the things that makes it such a great opening. And I personally really like playing Lucas and Justin's interpretation of the French, but I'm going to show a couple other interpretations here just for the sake of showing that there are many different ways that black can go about to try to execute these ideas. And so I have a position pulled up here, and this shows one interpretation of how black will try to get rid of those light squared bishops. And so the plan here is to have black keep their queenside knight on b8, play b6 to open up this diagonal for the bishop, and have the knight support that bishop and force off a trade of light squared bishops. And that's exactly what happens. Now, like I said, this is just one interpretation. It's more common for black to develop that knight to c6 early on, but this is a very valid way of going about it, knowing how important that it is to get off those light squared bishops. And so why don't we look at a variation to see how this actually comes about in an actual game, how we're able to employ this method. So we'll go through the opening moves here. We get into the advance variation. Of course, we play c5 to put pressure on the center, and they bolster the center with their pawn. And now, remember how we said, well, there's this interpretation where black just leaves that knight on b8? Well, in fact, there is a line in the advanced variation where black says, okay, well, I'm going to move my knight on to e7, but I'm going to move my king knight first. And then cartwheels it straight over to c6. So that's a little interesting, right? But black is doing this to delay the development of this b8 knight. So when white goes about their typical development, black makes that route for the bishop to go to a6 to swap off those pieces. And we get in this situation that we just showed. But one thing that you may be asking at this point was, well, why did black take the time to maneuver that kingside knight all the way over to c6? And so that one might be a good one for us to look at. The reason is tactical, actually. And let's imagine a situation where black did not maneuver that knight, cartwheel it all the way over to c6. So let's just pretend that that knight is not there. It's somewhere else. Maybe it's on h6 or e7. But what would white do in this position if that knight was not currently on c6? So go ahead and pause the video if you want and look for that. But the answer is that white would just take, when we take back with the knight, they would have queen to a4, which if this knight was not here, would be with check and double attacking that knight on a6. So that is one interpretation. That is one way that black goes to try to swap off that light squared bishop. Now, another way that can be employed by white or by black to get rid of that light squared bishop, it's a little bit more crude, but it's viable and effective, is to just play a6 with their knight on d7, and the idea is to prepare bishop to b5. And that there's lines where they do that, where they delay the development of the b8 knight again, just play bishop to d7 right away and play a6. And the idea is bam, bishop b5, forcing a trade. So another interpretation of how to get rid of those light squared bishops. And in this position, black would even probably on the next move consider playing b4. That actually is the main way that they do it in this variation, to keep the knight from developing to their ideal square. And so you may say, well, man, that's a lot of time for black to spend in setting up this swap of light squared bishops, because we moved this bishop twice to exchange a bishop that had only moved once, and we also had to spend this move on a6 and then b5. And the thing to know is that with this center being locked up and closed, we can afford to spend a little bit more time to do maneuvers like this, to swap off our problem bishop for white's good bishop, because when that center is locked, it's more difficult for them to attack us in a real quick manner. So that is another interpretation, and we'll just look at one last one here. It's a little bit more advanced than these two, but that method is, you get your kind of typical development here where your knight had come out to b6, or sorry, c6, the queen had developed to b6. So as we see crossover themes from video 1, putting pressure on d4, and in this position, this kind of setup, what black can do is actually play for knight to a5. And the idea is once again to open up that bishop to come to the b5 square to swap off bishops. So might get something like this. And voila, we've gotten rid of those light squared bishops, and we kind of tied two themes. We tied themes from video 1, where we put pressure on the center, and from this video where we're talking about swapping off those light squared bishops. And this is a great idea because in this position, this knight is ready to jump to c4. That is often a very good square for the knight in the French defense. The rook is ready to come to c8, support that knight and contest the c file. So these are just a few ways I wanted to show, methods, plans for black to try to swap off that light squared bishop. And so we're going to just kind of finish up the video here, looking briefly at an alternative means of solving the problem of our bad bishop if we are unable to swap off that bishop. So we looked at ways of potentially swapping off those light squared bishops, but let's say that we weren't able to do that, at least we weren't able to do it quickly. Then when we're stuck with something we don't like, well, we can at least try to make it better, right? And so one very common idea in the French defense is in a position like this where we look at our bishop stuck behind this e6 pawn, is we can play f6. And the idea behind this maneuver is that we are going to maneuver and dance this bishop to d7, to e8, and then out to the king side. So we're going to activate it. It might take a few moves to do that, but as we discussed before, if the center is fairly stable, sometimes we can afford the time for those maneuvers. And you can imagine if we got the bishop out to h5, we could even consider trying to exchange it for that knight and just get rid of the bishop. So that is a very key concept in the French. And one thing that we should look at here before we wrap up the video is just discuss what happens after we play f6. Well, it's possible that white doesn't capture our pawn on f6, and in that case we can always consider capturing on e5 ourselves, just playing f takes e5. And you can imagine a situation like this where we started out putting pressure on d4, but now we can try to put pressure on e5. That's the pawn that we would try to attack and tie white down to if possible. So that is a possibility. Now, the other possibility is that they do capture us. E takes f6. And there we have, a few different choices here. We can just take with the rook and then try to get pressure down the f file. Or we could actually retake with the bishop. And normally in the middle game, we'll be retaking with these pieces. Generally, not always. But notice that when we retake with the bishop, more pressure on d4. So we're kind of combining ideas from part 1 where we're trying to pressurize the center with part 2, this video here, where we're trying to activate that light squared bishop. So it's kind of like a dual purpose thing happened here. We're going to make a avenue for the bishop to dance out and become active, and we are exerting more pressure on the center. Now, I guess one thing to mention, it's a little beyond the scope of this video, but there are situations where we could consider taking back with the g-pawn as well. This might be particularly useful in the endgame, or if the center is stable and we think we can castle queenside, we may consider that as well. So those are the two key ideas that I wanted to cover in these two videos. I hope you found them informative and got some use out of them. And I hope you enjoy playing the French defense. I am really enjoying it and looking forward to learning a lot more about the French. So have a good one, everybody.